So we're going to take the next about 45 minutes and talk about what we don't know yet, what we heard that made our head explode, what we want to know more about, what we want to know less about, and what are our hopes for our communities or our organizations. So who has the most provocative thing they want to start with? I don't know. If you say it, it's probably going to be provocative. You want to go? You want to get started? All right. This table told me they had a great discussion back here. So who wants to start? Yeah, you do. That's good. She already picked on you. It's great. What were you talking about?
I did not.
She picked on you, right? What were y'all talking about back here?
Okay. Everyone except for one at this table is from Lancaster County, city, and various entities, foundation and chamber. And so we were talking about what are our next steps, and in terms of, do we try to come up with one big vision and work towards that, or is it really assessing what are the assets we already have in the community and how they connect regionally, and not trying to model ourselves off of neighbors or something that has already been successful for another community. I also think because of the population growth in our county, we can't take 2 to 5 years to come up with a plan. This is something we need to do as quickly as possible.
Anybody else agree with the Kettering Foundation's motto that imitation is limitation? That's one of the things they say regularly is you can't ever go out and just copy somebody else. You gotta take your own community assets into account first.
I guess another way of thinking about that, and maybe this is a question for Ball State, but I hear a lot of who's my sister city, or I guess brother city, like who's my national city comparison? And if we're looking at a maturity model of like, this is where we are, and this is where we want to go, but just incrementally, is that something like, so this is a project I would love for North Carolina. Just like if you are Goldsboro, North Carolina, like who's your sister city that you could be looking to? And then maybe that gets updated every couple of years. And I mean, I've even thought about like maybe the School of Government houses that. I mean, I don't know. But so is anyone talking about that? Is that, Emily, can you do that?
This time next year.
So here you go. Y'all want to answer that? Who is everybody's everybody? I thought you were going to give it to the sociologist.
We have the answer. It's a 3100 by 3100 matrix, so I don't have it off the top of my head. But yeah, we actually pulled it out of this to sort of give some comparison. We can know on quality of business environment, quality of life. It's easy to do sorting tables and population or that sort of thing, but we will be able in the website to provide you could pick the places that are, closest to you on quality of life or close to you in quality of business, and then maybe look at them. And so we're going to do some of that in our field work, is to try to make comparisons of cities that are very proximal to one another. Those are good comparison places. You'll be able to look at 700-800 variables on that area.
Some of you know, most of you, how many here have ever been on an inner city visit with their local community? Yeah, people do this all the time. They go out and most Chamber of Commerce organize it. It usually makes some money, but they organize it. Also gives them free ability to lobby their strong people who are on that trip. But currently, for instance, Raleigh, Indianapolis, and Nashville are doing a joint, I think it's a 5-year joint learning process between the 3 communities. So it's not unusual for communities to try to find someone, but if you can help figure out who that someone is that you ought to marry, that's probably the best way forward. What else were lunch conversations about?
A couple things. One was thinking of recession. What have we learned from the last one, and how are we thinking about preparing for the next one, if it's coming? And it seems to that it is. And the other conversation that we had was, and this sort of tags along Carl's comment earlier, and that is, how do we think about persistent poverty as being an integrated piece of a lot of the data and a lot of the strategies that are being put in place, because it has a profound impact on everything we're talking about. And sort of as a corollary to that when we talk about equity and inclusion, it's a really important issue, but I think in many people's minds, that often goes to interpersonal conversations about racism. when in fact there really needs to be much more thought about how you include inclusion, equity, what are the words you want to use for that, because it can mean so many things, and how we are structuring systems in the work that we're doing. And maybe that is a real point of conversation.
So anybody want to deal with racism, persistent poverty, and recession as the 3 happy things after lunch? There you go, do recession.
I'm gonna. So I've done some work on recessions, and basically the last recession really hammered existing trends. So it basically two communities that said, if you don't know what trend is going on, we're gonna make sure we drill it into you. This is the trend, and we're gonna really, really hit you hard on the trend if you haven't been taking these market indicators before. So pretty much every recession has done that for the last few, but this last one especially really hammered home existing trends. And so what we showed, so I won't touch so much on the racism, but on a little bit, what I think is kind of cool what we're doing is when you look at some of these outliers, a city like Harrison, Arkansas, that does worse than we'd expect. It should be doing great, but it's not. And from an economist point of view, this is kind of cool because we should be addressing racism for a whole lot of reasons, equity reasons, equality reasons, because it's right. But even for the economists who don't buy that stuff, right? There are people out there that aren't gonna buy those reasons. Fine, you should be doing it because your community will suffer. Your jobs will suffer. Your wages will suffer if you don't address this. So if you're not gonna address it for what we kind of think are the right reasons, fine, address it, because if you don't address this, the market is showing you, it's giving you these indicators. By not addressing this, Harrison, Arkansas, you're losing out on jobs, you're losing out on people, your city will die.
One of the things from the last recession we learned is that we're going to tighten up the ability for people to build houses so that they don't put us in a housing bubble. So lots of small home builders are not in the marketplace anymore, which we're having, as you see, externalities based on housing right now. So recessions have impacts long term, but I agree that things are moving so fast, that's the next set of trends you're going to have to look at as you move forward. Anybody want to deal with racism or persistent? Let's do persistent poverty, since we've been worried about it for 50 years and we're being so successful at it so far. I'm not joking. I mean, it's not. If Southern Growth Policy Board, which Linda and I both used to work at, did studies back in the 70s on poverty rates across the South, and all of the plans talked about how you deal with poverty, and the think tank was around for over 40 years, and the poverty numbers, percentage-wise, didn't change much in 40 years with all the attempts. It was tough.
I think the simple answer is shared opportunity overcomes racism.
This works. How do we, I'm not going to let him off. How do we get the shared opportunity?
Well, that's a good question. but no. I mean, we come to those places where some groups have more wealth than others, and so it's not a sharing. Everybody gets the same. So we need to get to that place where those that have more say, well, I'll take a little less because this group has less, and so they can get more.
And that bumps us up against racism, right? Because when racism comes in the picture, there's a deeply entrenched belief on some people's part that some people have less because they want less, deserve less, are capable of less, all of those things. So I was going to say, related to that, though, is that one of the things that I'm taking away, I'm going to look at the exact question. The question was asked, how can we make this community the very best community for the people, and I'd say all the people, who live here now? I don't even hear that question being asked in the community in which I live very often, which is this one. And I don't see how you can really get started on anything productive that's going to be successful if that is not the driving force of the leadership of whoever's making decisions.
You still up?
I don't have an answer. I wish I did. It's a question I also grapple with, which is why I wanted to at least say something. I have with me a paper that Nancy Andrews just recently put out, previously from the Low Income Investment Fund, writing about calling the field of community development to really come back to its roots and take race, gender, and equity, those structural drivers, back to the core of community development. And I think what we're seeing where there is progress in those spaces, I think there's a lot of promise where folks are coming together across community development and economic development and community power building and organizing groups. I think it is that finding common ground. It's not one of those fields or sectors has all of the answers, but in doing stuff together and finding common ground, there becomes a more holistic picture. So I think it's a very active conversation among a set of people. What I'm curious about is I find it's more active in urban centers and less active in the rural and micropolitan conversations, and I'm really interested in what does it look like to bring those conversations a little bit more together. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, if we think back to the 1975 model, right, and industrial recruitment, there was so much effort placed on what does this company want? What does it need? Let's give it to them, right? Let's figure out a package. Is there as much research being done with folks, with people who aren't doing well in your community about what's keeping them from getting ahead? I mean, the big talent problem that a lot of companies have in hiring could be satisfied by people who are already living in the community who don't have jobs for some reason. But the barriers are no transportation, the barriers are no childcare, the barriers are not necessarily right education, it's not healthcare. It may not be that those resources don't exist, but they're not packaged to make it possible for people who live in the community to advance within the community itself. So can we do as much research as we did with trying to recruit companies by trying to recruit people who aren't doing well in our community into jobs that exist or into opportunities in the community? So, I mean, you know, where is our energy going? Because a lot of people think about it, as I said yesterday, if you don't design at the front end of a development effort with the people that you want to have benefit, the full range of people, including low-income people, places, and firms, if they're not part of the sort of like figuring out what we're going to do, they're likely not going to be part of the benefit. So that's one of the things that we've got to take that very seriously as a piece of work. And Michael said it yesterday, too, at the front end. And as you said, it really wasn't done at the front end here, right? And so he, I think what he told us yesterday was he learned that here, that they didn't do it at the front end, and you got to get out ahead.
Save you some steps, Ted. So, you know, the Raj Chetty et al. Data came up earlier. I always feel bad because it's always Raj Chetty and not everybody else who did the work. But you know, they figured out what are the things that are indicators or precursors to people having low economic mobility, and it's residential segregation, which we have a great deal of in North Carolina. And if anybody can figure out how to work on that, I'd love to help you. It's school quality, which goes back to residential segregation because of how we district our schools and how we fund them, and how both in terms of state appropriation and local supplements. And it's social capital. You know, we know what the reasons are, and then we did some focus groups with people who live in poverty about, well, what do you think's holding you back? And the things overlapped a lot. It was, well, one, you know, I have children, and if I want to work because I want to earn a living wage, but how am I going to work if I don't have a safe place for my children to go? So it's childcare, it's transportation to get to and from work. It was health care, which North Carolina still has an expanded Medicaid. This is Emily talking and not the school government, by the way. And I know, that's why this is Emily talking and not the school of government. But it's healthcare, and so I'm really interested in the implications, and the Institute for Emerging Issues is doing work on this too, about healthcare as a workforce issue, and that some site selectors and folks who are looking to make investments look at the health outcomes of a community and the workforce. And if you see the high rates of diabetes and hypertension and heart disease and cancer, that makes you think, I might not want, this might not be where the workforce is for me. Yeah. We also have low labor force participation in North Carolina. So I think we know the causes. I think we need to, I feel like we know the causes. Now we need the strategies to address those causes. Thank you for letting me process with you.
As I walk to the back, by the way, health outcomes are part of our workforce stuff for companies. They do want to know that. They want to know availability of health care, but they also want to know health outcomes of the workforce.
Thank you. I think I just wanted to make a point on this because this conversation is something that happens everywhere. And there's just one glaring piece of it that we don't ever want to talk about, and that's behavior and self-segregation, that every piece of data backs that up. And I think, and so even I push back on when people say, well, they're having a conversation in urban areas. They are, but the data still backs up that they're choosing to then live very deeply self-segregated communities. Washington Post did a story the other year. Pew Research has a bunch of data to back this up. And so I think the challenge for policymakers, and I'm not one to always defend politicians, but I think for any politician at local or federal state government trying to make this decision, the public is saying one thing, but all the data backs up the public does something completely different in their normal behaviors. Go to any economic development, business development conference in the state of North Carolina, that room will not be diverse by any real margin. And I think we have to start being honest about how intentional we are about that first and our behavior before we talk about it in the idea phase. That when all the protests came out and the conflicts with minority communities and police, they went back to Charlottesville. And it was interesting, they did a documentary. And what they interviewed, the majority of the white citizens were saying, we were so shocked by this is a peaceful community. Majority minority community saying, we were not shocked by this at all. This is an undercurrent that's been there. And I think that friction, and even with millennials, there's a danger, and I'm constantly there to push back on my friends. Behavior of how they choose to live and it's one thing to want a school to be equitable. It's another thing when you have kids and well, I hope that school gets better. I'm not sending my kids to that school. And I think we have to be honest about that piece of it before, or we'll 15 years from now be still having the same conversation.
So I spent a little time at the table. We were talking about gentrification, and that was something that was thrown out yesterday and talked about a little bit today. And I'm a believer in price dictates preferences. I think that's 100% accurate. And so a lot of our communities, I think, have neighborhoods that are in distress. They're often communities of color. Always communities of high poverty. And so when you go in to make investments to improve the quality of life in those neighborhoods, the checkbox of the result is that there's price appreciation. Because when you have a basis of a house that might be $20,000, there is no economic way to improve that house without increasing its value. Like, I put a roof on my house. My house was in good shape. It was just a maintenance item. It didn't increase the value of my house. If you invest in that house that's dilapidated, putting houses, bathrooms, and all that, it's going to increase the value of the house, and it's going to put upward pressure on rent. And there's really not enough tax dollars or tools, at least in this state, to maintain the affordability of that house. I mean, if we've got an inventory of over close to 500 dilapidated houses, in order to do a bond referendum in our community to, let's say, fix all of those houses rather than tear them down, you're probably talking about a $30 million bond to make that work. Our community cannot do a $30 million bond without revenue to pay the debt. So I think it's a really interesting question that probably needs some more looking at, is the strategies that small, micropolitan, and poor communities can do to avoid the displacement. It's really difficult. I mean, there may not be an answer to this. We do low-income housing tax credit projects that actually just puts more downward pressure on the dilapidated houses, to be quite honest. It's great for the new owner or the new renter that can get there. But I think it's a really difficult question that we're all going, if we're successful, are going to have to address, as was mentioned yesterday with Durham. Durham should have got ahead of it. They didn't. Now they're having these problems with displacement. Certainly don't want that happening. In Wilson, we're doing a Tiger project on 301 that's benefiting the low-income and minority communities in that area. My fear is that, at some point, someday, if we're very successful, that may push some people out. I don't think it's going to change the equation of race or poverty, but there's going to be some people that could be displaced because of price. And we've already actually seen the market invest in houses privately without any input from the city. There was not an incentive for that investment. So I'm just curious what people, maybe there's other strategies that people could share that address that issue.
Any solutions to housing issues?
I mean, it's a much longer thing, but just this is another example of where people have to get creative. So in Kentucky, an organization called MESA, the Mountain Association for Community Economic Development, realized there was a lot of dilapidated housing that needed upgrades, and they worked with the power company to allow on-bill financing for rehabilitating housing that needed energy efficiency upgrades, all kinds of things. So there's new housing, there's also improving the quality of the housing that's there. So they were able to do it on-bill financing so that you made the home energy efficient, which improved the housing quality. The on-bill financing let the homeowner themselves pay it off over time, at the end of which, and it ended up being a wash because the energy savings basically paid for that. Right? And the third thing is it created jobs. So they then trained some people who didn't have jobs to do the actual weatherization. So it's an example of thinking through the whole system of what can make things better and whose self-interest is it in and how can we put those partnerships together. So, and you would think, well, why would the power company want to do that? Because then people are using less energy. Well, they were able to sell the energy somewhere else. So it worked out. But creative solutions, and there are more and more creative solutions around, doing gap financing that unleashes more funding for other kinds of housing as well. But just one example.
Going back to poverty, I think a quote for everyone to remember is nothing about us without us. To underscore some things, Emily, you said, if you ask poor people why they do what they do, you'll see that many times they are rational actors. If you haven't grown up in poverty, you don't know what their context is, so you have no framework for understanding why they're making the decisions that they're making. A lot of times, though, they are rational actors. And so as you're talking about what strategy do we need to make, I don't know, but you need to ask the poor people in your town. You need to start getting to know them. They have answers for what the limitations are. And I realize that takes resources, and a lot of our institutions aren't built with the capacity to ask outsiders. That is sharing power. And I realize a lot of institutions aren't built to accommodate that yet. If you have not grown up in poverty and you're looking for a place to start, I highly recommend the book Framework for Understanding Poverty. Anyone who's been through an education degree or a sociology degree has probably read it. It's by Ruby Payne. It's a practitioner's manual. And even if you didn't read it entirely, if you just looked at the charts, it would explain so much to you. If you have not grown up in poverty, there's a new language you need to learn, just as much as learning Spanish or Russian would be completely different. So it's Framework for Understanding Poverty by Ruby Payne. we're talking about making strategy, equally as important, I think, is making space. Do your local institutions and positions of leadership have space for new types of people to be there? Whether that's me, I'm about to be in my 7th year living in Danville. I'm not from there. Before I got there, people made space for millennials and outsiders. I didn't know that you could serve on a board if you're younger than 50, but when I showed up in Danville, the first friends that I made were all serving on boards in their 20s. That wasn't serendipity. People made space, and sometimes you make space by giving someone your chair. Sometimes you can't make the table bigger immediately, so you don't pull up a chair for someone else, you give them your chair. So be making strategy with the people that it affects, but also be making space for them. And one of the ways you can do that is think about in your businesses, your offices, your think tanks, your institutions, what are your implicit rules? Every single grouping, whether it's your family, your church, your office, your company, they all have implicit rules. And you might not think they're there, but you really notice when someone violates them. And that's one of the barriers that keeps people of color, people from a poverty background, people from outside your community, people who didn't get business etiquette training. It keeps them from getting their foot in the door, and it keeps them from advancing. So whatever your group is, figure out what your implicit rules are and make them explicit. If it's that important that you would not hire someone or not advance them, if it's that important, why not write it down then? Why not say it out loud so that you can set people up for success? So in summary, nothing about us without us. Make strategy with the people in poverty, read Framework for Understanding Poverty, and make your implicit rules explicit.
You're good.
I think those were really great points, and I would add on top of that it's often not enough to make room at the table, right? So I go to communities that have really large immigrant populations that they're saying, oh, we've told them that we want them to be on our boards, that we want them to be on city council. We've made room at the table for them, and they're still not coming, and we don't know what else to do. But they're not looking at those barriers that they're facing. So they're still expecting people to come to them, right? So what does it look like for you and your board or your community organization or whatever to meet people where they are? And to be thinking differently about what leadership looks like, how leadership meets, what that process looks like. So really addressing not just the rules, right? Those kind of implicit rules, making those really explicit, but just looking at what are the potential barriers to getting the people at the table that we want to be at the table, and making sure that you're actually addressing those barriers. And again, it's basic things like not everybody is comfortable in a government building or even in an office setting. So how do you make people more comfortable and more likely to come? Some people are going to need translation services. Some people are going to need transportation services. Some people are going to need childcare services. And all of that is incredibly important. And then once you're able when people are able to see themselves in leadership roles, then they're going to be able to kind of rally around what the community is doing a little bit more. So it's going to be a little bit easier to actually engage those really difficult communities to engage when they've got somebody in leadership that they can see and say, that person has my background and my experience, so maybe my voice does matter. It's incredibly important, but we have to think completely differently about the way that we actually do leadership.
I haven't said anything. It's about that time, right? There you go. Sure. I'll come back to you in just a second. This is not about this. Is this about this? Okay, let's go that way. All right. I should have put my Fitbit on today. I get credit for this.
I'll try to make this comment very, very simple, and it is based in part on what was just shared, but also something that was shared last night during the community tour. I agree that it is important to make room at the table, think about leadership differently, think about the implicit biases that we bring to the process. But just simply put, it's also important for us to be very cognizant of the lens through which we see and experience the world, because that then informs how we receive information that people provide once they are at the table and they are sharing their voice. And we're thinking about strategies that should be implemented in our communities. Last night, one of the things that was shared, and of course, I'm cognizant of the lens through which I see the world, so maybe I received it differently from how it was meant. But what was shared about the new art center that is also a children's museum, and I believe one other thing is there, it was previously a library, was that African Americans here in this community felt like that wasn't a place for them. And I think what was stated almost verbatim was, because we don't do arts. And I found that hard to believe, especially after the response was, so we then redeveloped the Booker T. Washington Theater. Well, if you heard we don't do arts, but then you develop the Booker T. Washington Theater, which is for the arts, you really didn't hear what the community was saying. I think a part of it was, what has been developed does not reflect who we are and the cultural aspects of who we are that are most important to our community. So again, I think it's important when we have folks at the table, we are engaging them in conversations, that we're very cognizant of the lens through which we see the world and how that lens filters the information we're receiving and what we then choose to do with it.
How many of you, as I walk toward the back, think you're good at seeing the world through other people's lenses, other groups' lenses? We find that when we're doing community work, that if you put a group in different pockets and you give them a different task, that you see lots of different points of view. They're really different sometimes.
So just final comment on that, and as rolling this back up again, it seems to me that for purposes of the conversation earlier today, this is about how inclusive growth becomes one of the tenets of every economic development strategy. I mean, to me, that's sort of where that links. I have another totally unrelated question. I live in Richmond. A lot of conversation about the census. And I'm really interested in knowing in some of the micropolitan communities if you really are paying attention to this and trying to ensure that the counts are what they need to be.
Anybody tuned in on the census yet?
Yeah, we've had a couple of sessions with both counties in the city. We're keenly aware of it and keenly aware of the financial implications of it. In all cities, I don't care if we're referring to LA or New York or cities like Rocky Mount or Wilson, there is a segment of our population that, understandably so, has a significant distrust in the government, especially on the federal side. With the immigration situation like it is, they're going to be very slow to give information. And there's a crazy number, I think it's 77 years or something like that, that the information is frozen. No one, IRS, Justice Department, our president, can get to that information. But having someone primarily in an impoverished area or neighborhood, or an immigrant, legal or not, is a whole different challenge. And we're trying to come up, to answer your question, with ideas of how to get through that, whether it's faith-based community or what, to get that accurate number, because it's worth, it financially can be a game changer for communities like ours, either up or down. But yeah, that's being talked about. The 10-year number is the important one. The estimates, those are just numbers like economists throw out. The 10-year number is, well, I'd hated to look at them. They might slap me. But the 10-year number is where the dollars are locked in for the next decade. You know, these 5-year census guesstimates, or we think Rocky Mount grew or shrank last year based on whatever. Hell, we don't know where we are. There are just too many people that hold that information back.
Yes, we have a significant strategy that's being employed. In fact, our fellow from the Institute of Government is one of the leaders of that effort that will include faith-based communities, obviously a lot of migrant workers in agriculture, so we're working with farming communities. If people will talk to us, we'll meet with them and help them with resources and whatever else they need to make sure we get the most accurate count. And especially back to the housing question, I mean, obviously, Wilson has a significant interest in getting to a threshold where we can get direct HUD allocation versus, having to compete with small towns and dirt roads and inadequate water sewer through the state grants that, frankly, we just don't compete well with, because we are advanced enough with our infrastructure that we can't. We're poor, but I guess we're not poor enough to get those dollars.
Anybody else on census? Okay, so let me ask a question. Who, I know y'all are don't lie to me, who hasn't said anything in the last 2 days? Raise your hand if you haven't spoke up. And you knew what was coming, and I apologize, but it's just gonna happen.
So one of my questions were about, it hit home to me, the amenities and the quality of life things that are come. And, certainly the natural ones you can't change. You can change the governmental controlled ones like investment in schools. But the private sector ones, what would you say are some kind of emerging amenities? I mean, a few years ago we had a Main Street conference, and I felt like it was all about breweries and bakeries. But what are the kind of new amenities that you see bubbling up that communities could maybe get ahead of? That they have control over?
So our data right now can't get that fine, but what I think the best answer is it depends, which is also the worst answer. But I think in some communities, so where I live, it's yoga studios. We've got a few of them, and they're all doing very well. Sorry. But I wouldn't go to every community and say build 2 yoga studios. You could build a yoga studio that some people would never go to. But I think it's kind of empowering for communities, because it's asking those people and giving them the courage and the guts to say, what do people in this town want? Is it a yoga studio? Is it a new coffee shop? Something other than Starbucks? What is it? And I think they know better than anybody else, and empowering them to say, just do it. Start a business, right? If you know there's other people like you that want that fill in the blank, do it. Because nobody else is going to come in and know your town and know what people want, other than someone who's lived there and like, man, all my friends really wish there was, whatever it is, a dance studio for our kids. There's no dance studio. Whatever it is, they know. And so you really got to empower entrepreneurs, young people, whoever it is, to say, if you see a need, fill it. Don't wait for someone else to come in and fill it.
I think that's exactly, you're going to have to adapt as it goes. I mean, I can't tell you how many people have lost their life savings on cupcake shops. You think about how many of them opened and are still here. In 1990, I took over as economic developer in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I went up and down the street, asked everybody what they wanted. Everybody said, we don't have a coffee shop. So little old me went out and tried to recruit coffee shops. We got 6 of them. 5 of them went out of business. And so what I did is take 5 people's life savings by promoting it. The market has to respond to what you need. Mountain biking, remember skateboard parks for a while? I mean, sanatoriums are hot for a little while. Depends on what your community needs, I think. Ask. There's going to be some recreation people want. There's going to be some art. If you go into any small community and you go ask people, put a YP group together and say, what do you want? I can tell you the first thing out of their mouth is there's not enough to do. The second thing you ought to ask is, what do you want to do? And they want a place to gather. Third places are real popular right now, creating spaces, you know, like right out here on the patio kind of stuff. But it's going to change. So what really, I mean, how many small communities opened a theater, the theater sound, or didn't open a theater and now they have one? So quick changes.
I would say being very skeptical of silver bullet solutions, regardless of whatever they are, is the way to go. So if somebody comes and says, you need to do X, Y, and Z to make your community a better place, be very skeptical of that. Think about what it is behind that, right? So maybe it's the third place that we're wanting to have some gathering place. And maybe that's what it is. And maybe it doesn't make any sense to have a brewery in your town, but maybe you could look at some other way to do it, but also in the context of the wealth that you already have. So maybe your cultural capital and your social capital is crazy strong, and you actually don't need to be thinking about having another third place in your community. So thinking about kind of what's behind those silver bullet solutions, if there's anything that you can take out of that, and then thinking about it in context of what your community actually currently has, building on those current assets to adjust to the challenges that you're facing. Because that's different in every single place.
Who else hasn't said anything in 2 days? I knew this would get tough because you're going to lie to me now, right? Did they leave already? The people who didn't say, all right. You are the talkative crowd. Okay, last question for you. There we go.
It's actually a question, and I don't know if other people will have answers to this, but how do you create a culture within a community of empowerment and organizing that comes from the community itself? I'm really trying to sort of wrap my head around that idea, and what is a way that you build that level of engagement so people feel a part of the institutions. And I know part of it is the institutions themselves making space, but how can you even create that externally, or what can you do to support it?
People are thinking, we say the first thing you do is change your language, that you don't have us and them language. You have our community language, you have all of us language, and so you quit. So politics today is tough for this, because it's out there dividing communities right in the middle a lot, and that's tough. But yeah, you have to have goals that are community goals, not the Chamber of Commerce's goal, not the Community Action Committee's goals, but community goals. So you start with language and about building sustainable, good things in your community, whatever they happen to be. Other people, how do you get people to work?
So, and I don't know that this completely answers your question, but it's something that I have found myself thinking over the last 2 days is, you know, we're talking about small communities. And so I think when we do that, we really think about it, almost everything we've talked about involves face-to-face interaction. I mean, it's people we know, it's streets we walk down. And so you hit a level where it's trust, as simplistic as that sounds. And so you may be able to do that as an individual yourself, you may not. You may need to enlist the help of other people, but I think even talking about things like focus groups, you know, how many times have you seen a focus group held, you ask for feedback, someone takes that on board, but there's no action to come back to, or there's no report back to individuals. And so I think for me in the seat that I sit in, I think about that a lot, because if you don't have the trust of the communities, I would venture to say it would probably be pretty rare that you're really getting any true, real feedback from those people either.
There was some thought of inviting people to the table. I would tell you, in my community work, there's plenty of tables of discussion in the communities themselves. So I say, if you want to touch the community, you need to you need to find those tables because they exist, and then get educated from that, and then determine what you might bring to that table to enhance the thoughts and desires of those folks. And so again, you can need to go in there with a blank sheet, so to speak, in terms of, not, you don't want to, again, because it's the helicopter concept. You drop in and you're going to save the world kind of deal. That's a turnoff. So again, people talk, people have issues, they care, and they find some way to communicate with one another. So you got to figure out how that works and try to weave your way into it and not go in with a solution. You go in, you listen, and then you figure out what incrementally you can do to assist them or the community in moving the needle forward on the issues that they care about.
Sometimes I think it's plain old information, and using the buzzword today, storytelling. But it's amazing, I think, what people really don't know that goes in their community, and begin to tell the stories about all parts of the community so that people really understand things, hopefully, that are going on that go well. A local newspaper that I know just started what they called sort of an education corner, in which had information about what was going on in the various schools, grammar schools, high schools, higher education, whatever. People talk about that all the time now because there are things in that no one ever knew were going on. So I think information is important.
Anybody else? Okay, so on behalf of our team, we're glad that you let us be part of this again. I'm going to turn it back over to Clark. Remember that next year there'll be all sorts of data and information done, right? Hopefully, yeah, all ready for people to use. We'll be looking for a spot for next year's conference. Anywhere in America that wants to hop up and volunteer, just reach out to us. We'd love to go somewhere else. Is it a beach? Is that what we're looking for? Or mountains or something? Warm weather? I don't know, something. Yeah. Kauai? Okay. We invited Hilo the first year of this. They wouldn't come, but we invited them because we were trying for a long-term play, but it didn't work out, so it's all right. So I'm going to turn it back over to Clark to close us out today. Evan is still doing a walking tour around. Is the beer shop open? All right, anyway, yeah, we'll see. But at least you get a pretty day for walking around, and let's thank you all for being part of a pretty good discussion.
So I'm not going to take long, but I did want to I want to do two things. First, I want to try to summarize some of what I've heard over the last 2 days, and I really do believe it's been a very rich conversation, and I applaud all of you for kind of showing up and speaking out and sharing, and I think the collisions happened as we hoped they would, and that's been really powerful. I think so. Yesterday, Michael on stage said, I think that, and I wrote it down, the next big fight will be quality of life, and we didn't prompt him to say that. He said that, and he's a for-profit economic developer doing this, and he believes that. And then we had our education team come in today and said, what we think is really important is quality of life, and so we see this kind of overlap. And then the other thing, the thread I want to pull on a little bit is this equity piece. And everybody's talking about that, and it's really important. And maybe how do we bring communities together to have this conversation? And I'll just tell you what we're doing. And I'm not saying that we've got the answers here by any means, but we have a team member of ours who we did a health equity report about 2 years ago, and we came out and we found that if you go up Main Street in Danville and you take a right, you go into Forest Hills, and if you take a left, you go over behind the community college in a place called Cardinal Village, and the healthy life expectancy disparities are 17.2 years. And we started looking at some of the hardest neighborhoods in our area, in the city of Danville. And we've got, as a region, we've got a median household income that's half of that of the state average. So we're a poor place. In some of these neighborhoods, we had median household incomes half of the regional average. And so what we did is we created an effort called Opportunity Neighborhoods. And we have a staff member who grew up in these neighborhoods, who started having conversations. And as Michael said, actually going to where these conversations were already happening and asking them if they could sit. And they had a little bit of trust because they grew up in the neighborhoods, but now they're working for the foundation, so there was still a little bit, we're not sure we can trust them anymore. And it took them 6 months to agree, that they could actually sit down. And but now we're 2 years into that, and what we did was we asked them in these neighborhoods, let us help you build a quality of life plan. And what does a quality of life plan look like for your neighborhood? And what we found is, other than the initial skepticism, is, well, nobody's ever asked. We're an old mill town that was run, by 3 folks or 4 folks for 100 years, and nobody got asked about anything, right? And the model was, and I argue actually that everybody liked it that way, okay? Because the 3 or 4 leaders actually liked to be little dictators, and they would say things like, well, nobody else will leave, I guess I'll have to. And a whole lot of folks in the community kind of liked it because they could stand on the sidelines and throw rocks the whole time. So this process of bringing people together is really hard. And what we think we see is, as has been suggested throughout the last 2 days, this is a 40-year effort. And you've got to be in it for the long term in your community. We think that's one of the roles that, as Janet's piece that they set out on hubs, it's got to be one of the roles the hubs play, right? They've got to be in it for the long game, right? We argue that one of the things our foundation does is we're able to take risk other people can't. We can make bets other people can't because we're not running for re-election. One of those risks we can take is we're in it for the long time, right? We're in it for the long term. So we think this effort's going to work, but it's not a silver bullet, right? But we think it's absolutely critical. And so when we think about our developmental curve, you've been there, you've seen the growth in the River District, and you've seen some cool things around workforce and other things. The next phase of our work, though, is bringing more people into this conversation, right? And actually backing up to some of our big bets and say, okay, now let's talk about the River District. And we just made a matching grant on a big park in the River District, really trying to enhance the quality of life. We've put up $4 million of a $10 million park if they can raise the extra money. But we've also said, and how are you going to have these conversations throughout the community and explain why this park is for the whole community? Not just the cool kids downtown. And they're reaching out and they're doing these things, and we think that's critical. So I really do think this equity conversation is kind of the next phase of this group's work, right, when we come together. Last week I was at the Southeastern Council of Foundations, and the headline was equity, and everybody's talking about equity. Every 2 years, as some of you know, our group takes a See the Possible trip, and we've been to Greenville, South Carolina, and we've been to Owensboro, Kentucky, and Dubuque, Iowa, and Chattanooga, Tennessee. And Chattanooga's been mentioned here, and Chattanooga's one of these places they've been writing about the revitalization forever. When we went there, it was the last trip we took, we went there and we said, so tell us, don't give us the chamber tour, how are you addressing equity? And they fumbled, and they were like, oh yeah, that's, we've got this cool downtown, and we got a new Volkswagen plant. And we said, yeah, how are the kids getting from this school to the Volkswagen plant? Well, they can't get there from that school. They're getting there from this school. And so part of our argument is that everybody is struggling with this. We're not in this alone, right? And I think that's why this is a rich conversation to continue and to share. And I appreciate everybody who brought that up and pulled that on the table for us to deal with, because I think it is the conversation going forward. And so I do appreciate that. I want to end with really just a thank you. I've thanked you, and I thank you all for coming, but maybe if we could give a couple rounds of applause, I would appreciate it. First, to Ted and Sarah and Greg and Carly and their team. They really do put this on, and they're awesome at putting it on, and thank you very much for your work. Ted mentioned this, but again, I want to kind of pull this out. We've done this for a couple years, and last year, Robert Wood Johnson and Katrina reached out to us and said, how can we help? And the research they're sponsoring, and they're sponsoring this conference, and in the next year's, in partnership with DRF, was able to bring the Ball State and Akron team and to start this research. And so everybody involved in helping us this research, and Katrina and Robert Wood Johnson, thank you, thank you, thank you. This is really important stuff. And I guess finally, I want to thank everybody here in Rocky Mount who hosted us, the crews who put together really great meals, and I think this was really a special place to have this, and the team who kind of took care of us, where you guys were awesome. Thank you very much. And I want to just end by reiterating something Ted said. Tell us what we need to do next. How do we continue this conversation? One of the things I've argued, for what it's worth, that we haven't done as well as we need to with our effort, with this group, is how do we make this stickier? How do we continue these conversations throughout the year, right? And so how could we do this better? If we set up a blog, if we do some podcasts, if we send out some regular emails, how would you like to continue this conversation? We'd all love to hear that. And how can we better do that so we don't just meet once a year and then we go away? How are we sharing pieces? We've got some great data here. And how do we continue to share pieces and build a tribe of people who are really trying to improve our communities? And that's what we're about. So I'm going to end there. Yes. We need your emails. If you haven't signed up yet for this conference that's now over, please do so. And one other group I didn't thank and was alluded to briefly, but Julie Brown and the Institute for Advanced Learning and Research, they're serving as kind of the fiscal agents for the Robert Wood Johnson grant and for this effort. And so if you want to get reimbursed, you need that email. You need the email to Ted's group, but Julie's group's going to write the check. So thank you, Julie, for writing the check. All right, that's it from me. Thank you all very, very, very much. We're going to do a walking tour right now with Evan, and we'll see you next year.